Well, first of all, thank you again for having me today. And thank you again for the lovely introduction. I'll give you a little bit more details about myself. So yeah, my name is Emma Uhl, and I'm an MLIS graduate from the lovely institution that is hosting this event, the U of A. Um, but before I began my career doing this sort of complicated library stuff that really makes me dread the question, so what do you do? I was a French immersion student, and then I majored in Japanese and minored in Spanish. And as mentioned, I've been working as a freelance Japanese to English translator for a hot minute. So basically, I'm really into language, and that's why I work at PKP in the role that I do. So the plan today is to give you some brief thoughts about multilingualism as a whole and its place in the publishing world, and then like a speed run, for lack of better terms, of how multilingualism works or doesn't work in OJS, as well as some general tips based on the current state of multilingual support. So this is a pretty brief and powerfully speedy talk. But if you need in-depth setting information, especially when it comes to the fineries of the OJS, please check out our multilingualism guide. It has a full-length recording of a webinar that I did earlier that is much more in-depth. And also, before we get into this, there's just two terms I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about. So very quickly, metadata is information about your article or publication or anything really. This is data about your data. So in our world, this usually means things like titles, authors, abstracts, publication dates, serial numbers, anything else you can think of. And secondly, the term locale versus language. So they're used interchangeably throughout this webinar and often throughout other documentation about using a software in another language. Locale is the computing term, and it refers to the entire package of all the files that allow a software to operate in another language. So you can understand them as meaning the same thing in our case here. So first, I just kind of want to motivate you to understand why multilingualism is important. And the we here and why do we care about multilingualism is pretty vague. It's also a little aspirational. So this is about me personally, the community that I come from of library publishers in Canada. But I hope that some of these things ring true for many of us. So some of the reasons that we're interested is that one, Canada is an officially bilingual country, so we have a natural motivation to understand how multilingualism works. We want to support our disciplines and departments that are centered around language acquisition and study of other languages. We believe that part of decolonization includes making room for research in languages other than English. We believe that challenging assumptions about how the world works based on language helps promote diversity in the research. And we hope that if interested publishers, editors, software developers like ourselves at PKP take this language inclusive approach, metadata and indexing services and other commercial projects may be inclined to follow our footsteps, follow our lead, and follow our practices and advice. So for some examples of how multilingualism can be a means of challenging these norms and assumptions in our world, language informs a lot of how we understand the world. And in this space, as information stewards, we spend a lot of time categorizing things, and many of us are strong believers in accurate metadata. But the way that we collect metadata reflects our biases and assumptions. So just an example that kind of has really haunted me for a while is the FNU problem. So have you ever used a delivery or a rideshare app and noticed that your driver has the first name FNU? Because I sure did. So I was curious about this because many of the FNUs I met didn't necessarily seem to be from the same country or region. So I opened my phone and I Googled the origin of the name. Well, it's actually an acronym. It means first name unknown. So we have hundreds, if not thousands, of Canadians and Americans, because the same thing goes for the US, who have been given an acronym for their first name on all legal identification because our forms do not accept the absence of a first name. This is not because they wanted to be represented this way. So this type of naming convention, the mononym, of having only a single name, is common throughout the world. And in other places, names reflect entire genealogies, as you can see in the example below. So at PKP, we recently had an incident with a large indexer whose name I've redacted from this slide, who told us that 90% of people have first and last names, and the outliers are likely entered in error. And here's some countries that I think would probably have some feelings about that. One of them, the middle here being Indonesia. So we recently sent one of our colleagues to Indonesia, which is a place where we have a large user base, but we haven't really had the opportunity to get to know them until quite recently. And this is a country where mononyms are very, very common. And we repeatedly heard from the users there that they were so happy to have the option to enter single names, because so many of them have been forced to enter their name multiple times in irrelevant fields and like poison their own metadata, poison their own scholarly record just to fit into the forms. So this is just my way of telling you that multilingual publishing right now in the year 2024 is inherently an alternative mode of publishing. It really is in the same vein as alternative publishing models, such as continuous publishing, or even alternate review models, open peer review. So like those models, when we are engaging in using these models, we are working against decades of cultural assumptions and systems that are built on sort of other systems. So again, even if it seems like the obvious or right thing to do to support multilingualism because maybe you're in a bilingual or multilingual country, you are working on a system that is built for monolingualism. So all of us who are in this space need to understand that multilingual publishing is not just a practical issue, it's also an ideological issue. So with that said, what can you do about multilingualism, especially as maybe an OJS user or a user of a similar content or editorial workflow managing system? So as a quick disclaimer, because this is such an alternative and sort of nobody can agree what they want to do with multilingualism, frankly. So the recommended practices around multilingualism in scholarly publishing are definitely part of an ongoing conversation. There's no one-fits-all solution. You should really work with your users and encourage the language communities around them or the discipline, the community around the discipline to develop their own set of best practices and let indexers, metadata services, and people like PKP know what's working for you and what's not working for you. So I just wanted to mention a few multilingualism scenarios because multilingualism can happen at different levels in publishing, and some of them may be suitable for you. Some of them, after maybe evaluating the labor and the platform's capabilities, may not seem in reach for you, and that's okay. So the four approaches that I've lined out here are the first approach, which is to publish articles in several languages without a translation. So this would mean accepting submissions, for example, in English and Spanish. And you will expect that your readers can either read in both languages, or they're willing to use translation tools, or otherwise they just understand that some of the articles are not for them. Another approach is to publish articles with translation, which is a quite labor-intensive method of doing it, with the translated version of an article included either as an additional gallery or as a separate article altogether, and we'll get into the difference of why you might choose between those two options later. Another approach is to translate only the article metadata, with the article text being left in the original language. So this can be useful for readers to understand if an article is related to their research, especially for areas where there's little research available. But some indexing services really do not like this. And also it can be frustrating for readers if it's not abundantly clear what language the actual article text is available in. And last but not least, you can go the route of simply making your site's user interface available in multiple languages, even if you don't have the capacity to manage multilingual submissions. So this can be seen as a nice gesture for countries or other cultural contexts where multiple languages are used. And you can combine these. A very popular one for OJS is to do number 1, 3, and 4, simply because these are the least labor intensive and the most accessible through OJS. So within OJS, when you want to install a new language for the entire installation, you'll need a site administrator account. So if you are using, say, a library publishing program or a hosting service, you may need to contact your site administrator to have them enable additional languages. Once they install the locale, then it will be available for all journals on the installation. So I used to have this really long, complicated way of telling you how to figure out how complete a translation is. But the honest to God truth is that we at PKP just need to come up with a better way to inform you of how complete these translations are. This has been sort of a hot topic at PKP because you can figure it out, but it's nobody who's not working at PKP wants to spend that kind of time doing it. But I will tell you that we do have 43 languages that are over 75% translated. So the coverage is pretty good. Again, I can't make any guarantees, but chances are, if you're working with a fairly dominant language, that we do have a passively complete translation of it. And for instances where translations are seeming incomplete, there is something called the default translation plugin. So when there is untranslated text, some text that maybe got looked over, was added in a later version, or translators haven't gotten to it yet, you'll see a string ID, which are these ugly things with the hashtags and the words separated by periods. So one way to make any translations that have a lot of these string IDs a little bit more usable is to enable the default translation plugin in the plugin gallery. So when this plugin is enabled, the untranslated text, which is in this case a string that is not very helpful for anybody, will be replaced with the English text. So you'll end up having mixed languages, but at least it's probably more readable than these strings. And then sort of as a note, if you see a ton of these string IDs when you're test driving a language, the translation may not be where you need it to be. So this is a great way to sort of test drive and take a look, see if you're finding a lot of these string IDs. So assuming that you've picked a locale that is decently translated and you want to use it on your site, you'll have a few options for enabling them. So the journal manager can go to website settings, set up limited languages, and you'll be given a list with all of your installed locales and a variety of options that can be selected for each one. So I'm going to fairly quickly go through each of the options to make sure that you fully understand what each one allows you to do. So the first one is the primary locale. The primary locale is essentially your default language and the one that the users will first see when they access your site. So we really strongly recommend that you be very careful about your primary locale selection and that you refrain from changing it once you've set up and launched your journal. The reasons for this are a little bit complicated and software-y, but essentially when you've set a primary locale, the journal decides, okay, the bare minimum information I need needs to be in this language. So then if you change it later, you're going to have a bunch of empty fields in potentially very important places. So please make your primary locale selection confidently and carefully. The next option that you can enable is your UI or user interface. So you can enable this option for as many languages as you like. And when this is checked off, the front end and back end interface will be available in that language. And users are basically now able to change the language at will. So in addition to the language toggle from the user menu shown in the previous screenshot, which I'll just double back to real quick, you'll see it down here in the upper right corner. You can also, many journals tend to use the language block. So this is a plugin that you can enable from the plugin gallery and then arrange it to your liking in the sidebar section of your journal's website appearance settings. This is a permanent menu with language options that will be seen on every single page of your journal. So users don't really have to look around so much for their language toggle. So the next option is the forms option, which again, you can enable this for as many languages as you like. So when you enable this, any fillable forms in the system, with the notable exception of submission metadata, will be available in that language. So this can be used to fill out content about your journal. So things like your journal descriptions, your author submission checklist, your author guidelines, copyright notices, etc. So you can see how this looks in practice in this screenshot. The language you currently have selected as your own OJS interface will be shown by default. And then you can show any additional languages by clicking the language name at the top right of the menu. And then this will display the same field alongside your interface language, which allows you to do sort of parallel translation of things like journal policies, information, etc. So forms and UI really work together in tandem to create a complete translated, how do I put it, user-facing portion of OJS. So not the forms especially does not really affect the dashboard, but as you'll see here, the language you currently have selected as your OJS interface will be shown by default, and then you can show any additional languages that have forms enabled from the menu at the top. And then when you click on the language, like this translation here, sorry, I'm getting a little messed up. Sorry, the translations of the default system text are the ones highlighted in red here, and then they're enabled by selecting the UI option for the selected language. So this red text shows up because I've selected the French UI in my language settings. And then this blue text is showing up because I've enabled forms in the French language and provided the parallel translation of my journal information. And this also includes some custom areas, such as your custom navigation. So this is why the book reviews at the top menu bar, the compte rendu de livre, is also available. So if by using forms and UI, you get this sort of combined, completely translated UI. And then last, but certainly not least, is the submissions option, which again, you can enable this for as many languages as you can handle. So this allows authors to specify the language of their article submissions and also allows authors, editors, and journal managers to enter metadata in the selected language for their submissions. So metadata is only going to be required in the language that they set as their submission language. So the very first language that they pick. That's the only metadata that will be absolutely required. And this is to say, one of the shortcomings with OJS right now is there's no way to require that authors include any translated metadata or any metadata in the language other than the primary. And additionally, the optional metadata can be added for any languages that you've enabled submissions for. So now your submission wizard, once you've enabled submissions, will show author metadata, authors the fields for every language, regardless of what they've chosen, and editors can, of course, add or edit multilingual metadata from the publication tab using the same sort of parallel text box system as the forms option. So editors can add the translated metadata or galleys, at a later stage in the workflow as well. I think I have the same slide twice in a row. That was messing me up. Okay, next one is multilingual metadata. So just to make it clear, the main thing that makes the multilingual publishing so challenging right now in the current climate is that journals are not islands. We have to connect to so many other metadata indexing, upstream, downstream services. And most indexing services have no sort of consensus agreement when it comes to how multilingualism is supposed to be handled or how it's supposed to appear even. And of course, our software has some shortcomings too. Right now, we have no way to display bilingual metadata side by side for the reader. As you've seen, that we love the parallel display in the dashboard, but readers don't get that luxury. So some people will use one field to enter multiple languages because then at least you can see them both at the same time. Another issue that our software has right now is that whatever language that the author picks at the time of submission can never be changed. So if they choose something erroneously, it immediately causes a problem. In fact, it's also very difficult to identify what language they've chosen as their primary sometimes. And lastly, like our UI for multilingual data entry is a little kooky overall. You may have seen some like globe icons. We've heard a lot about those globe icons. People do not like the globe icons. We have a lovely UI specialist working with us now who's made a ton of mockups, but it takes a lot of time for us to actually get that into the software. But we're hoping that we can work on all of these over some time. We'll be able to improve the software and make it better for you guys. This is just a video that is going to show you the issue with the lack of parallel metadata display for the user. So let me just play it and hope that everything goes well. Right, so what you're looking at right now is a French journal, of course. So you can see all of the text that you're seeing is in French. As far as you can tell, French might be the only entry that has any, French might only have, there might be only metadata in French. And you can see this already exists in some cases where titles are only in French, or that the language of the PDF is not marked if you're in a different UI. So one thing we'd really like to see sort of in the near future is the ability for our users to be able to see both the English and the French in parallel, or not have to switch languages to be absolutely sure that they're not missing any metadata. So I do have some basic multilingual metadata tips for you guys. Just basically 4 points that if you keep in mind, they'll make your life a little bit easier. I can't guarantee that every single indexer will be happy with these, but just right now, this seems to be a decent way of thinking about things. So the first thing that you should do is decide whether you want to use separate or combined records and stick to it. So what do I mean by this? Well, in most classical cataloging systems, translations are treated as separate works. So here we have the seminal work of Osamu Dazai, No Longer Human, the post-war classic from Japan. This is a translation. It is indexed separately from the original Japanese as its own individual thing. And this tends to be the way that most catalogs work, especially because they were based on physical copies. So the question is, do separate records really make sense for born digital content sometimes? when the library can house infinite editions of infinite books in infinite languages, theoretically, and the audience can speak infinite languages, theoretically? Does that change your approach? And honestly, historically, journal editors seem to think so. There's a strong preference towards one article record. So you only have one submission ID, if you're familiar with the OJS ID system, with multiple galleys and multilingual data all associated to the single submission ID. And there's also a tendency for aesthetic and display preferences to influence this decision, because if you have an issue that is sort of loaded up with many translations, it can maybe make your issues look cluttered or harder to navigate. So what I recommend is that you make a decision between separated records and combined records. Pick whatever calls to you, pick what makes sense, pick what seems to suit the types of indexers and discovery services that you know are very important for you and your discipline, and stick to it for as long as you can. Again, the positive for separated records is that they play well with DOIs and other cataloging systems of having your translations in two separate article IDs. The problem is that they're harder to nicely organize in most content management systems. They may make your issues feel padded or confusing to readers, and combined records will have all your versions easily parsable and easily located by users, but sometimes languages other than the primary language will not end up properly represented when the article is later indexed by an indexing or metadata service. So my next suggestion to you, and this is not a suggestion, it's a please do this, do not mix languages and metadata fields. So Canada in particular, we love parallel bilingual display. It's attractive to us, it's familiar, but you have to resist the urge, and you have to put your English in the English metadata fields and your French in the French fields. So the example is the classic Canadian example down here, to separate things with a slash. It's how things are often done in government even, but we should not be doing this in OJS. What we should be doing is having them separated in their two individual parallel fields. This is about the only thing that most indexing services can agree on right now, is that these should be separated. The next one that I have for you is that the PDF should match the metadata. So this is fairly simple. All of your OJS metadata should be present in your PDFs, and all of the metadata in your PDFs should be present in OJS. So if you have any translated metadata that you want to show off, make sure that's in your PDF as well. Especially if you're going to use the strategy of not translating your articles, that may mean having some metadata in a foreign language in an otherwise, for example, English text. This PDF and metadata consistency is really important to most indexing services, including the one whose logo is featured on this slide. So this can help mitigate some of the issues you might face when you're trying to work with indexers. And the last tip that I have for you is to make sure that you tag your galley languages in OJS. So when you have each galley or more than one galley or even one galley that corresponds to the main language of the article, then you need to have them tagged. And this provides a signal to the user that they might be reading the metadata for their language, but the article might not be in their language, or the article may in fact be available in another language. So this is a fairly simple process within OJS. It's just a drop down at the time when you're uploading and labeling a galley. Just make sure that it matches so that your users have a chance to know what they're looking at, essentially. So those are my big 4 tips that hopefully are useful in most multilingual publishing situations. So this is the end of our presentation, but I do have a few more just final notes. PKP is working real hard right now to improve our multilingual support over the next few years. We have a lot of initiatives, sort of, even if they're just in a fledgling stage, I know they're going to take a long time, and I know they're going to involve a lot of the efforts of our multilingualism interest group and community members who are sort of doing the work of experiencing the difficulties and then reporting back to us. And that goes for anybody in this room. If you ever have any suggestions, questions, or you just want us to hear about your use case and how OJS is or isn't helping you, please send me an email. I want to hear about it, like, genuinely. And I'm Emma at publicknowledgeproject.org. You can find me, I promise. Please let me know. And lastly, we do have some external resources and internal resources and all this kinds of stuff. So some of the plugs that I want to make today are for our documentation hub overall. Again, I somehow ended up with the job both doing documentation and multilingualism. So this is also just me promoting the other half of my work, but we have some documentation. We're working on improving the documentation all the time. We have it on all types of subjects. And the ones that may be relevant to you are our guide on multiple languages, which again, I plugged at the beginning of the video, but sorry, at the beginning of the presentation, but there's a lengthy video about this very subject. And then also our better practices and journal metadata guide is also sort of good for smoothing out some of the questions that you may have of how to best handle in sort of a universal manner your multilingual metadata at this stage. So yes, thank you. That was a lot in a short time. I hope it was at least a little interesting, a little bit informative. And I'd like to know if you have any questions or even just thoughts. What part of multilingual publishing makes you happy? What makes you mad? What are your dreams and philosophies about it? Your critiques, ideas, rants? Let me hear it.